In this tutorial we're going to look at vaccination. The first aim is, can you describe what a vaccination is? Very simple. Then can you explain how vaccinations work? And then finally, can you evaluate the pros and cons of vaccination? So I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of a history lesson. The story of vaccination began in the late 1700s, where a man called Edward Jenner did something incredibly unethical by today's standards. But as you'll find out, his unethical actions led to saving millions of lives, so I guess the ends justified the means. So smallpox was a disease that was killing many people around that time. The symptoms of smallpox, like chickenpox, cause many pustules to form on the skin's surface, but smallpox is far more aggressive. Now, Edward Jenner observed that milkmaids were often affected by a similar looking condition called cowpox. Now, cowpox isn't nearly as severe as smallpox, but what Jenner also noticed is that milkmaids were not affected by smallpox at all. In other words, milkmaids had seemed to have developed some sort of immunity to smallpox. Was it perhaps something to do with cowpox? So Jenner came up with this hypothesis that if you are affected by cowpox, you will become immune to smallpox. Now he just needed to find a willing test subject to test out his hypothesis, and this is where it became quite unethical. Jenner tested his hypothesis on an 8-year-old boy. Basically, he scratched the surface of his skin and infected him with some cowpox, which he extracted from some milkmaids. Now, the boy became mildly sick because that's about as bad as cowpox gets. But what was more interesting is what happened next. When the boy was exposed to smallpox, he didn't get ill. So the cowpox had somehow immunized him to smallpox. In other words, Jenner had just discovered the first vaccination, and the word vaccination comes from the French word for cow, which is vache. The key to understanding how this worked is knowing that cowpox and smallpox have very similar antigens on the surface of their cell membranes. The result of having similar antigens on the surface of each pathogen cell membrane meant our immune system would develop the same antibody which could lock onto both antigens and target and kill both diseases. But obviously cowpox being less virulent, less aggressive, meant that it gave our immune system more time to develop this antibody, whereas smallpox didn't give our body enough time, which is why smallpox killed. So that's the story of how vaccinations were created. So now let's get on to aim 1 and describe what a vaccination actually is. A vaccination is a dead or an active form of the pathogen you wish to develop an immunity against. In other words, we're trying to trick our body into thinking it's infected so it starts to develop the correct antibodies to fight the disease. So you can see inside this vaccination syringe we've got these pathogens, and the pathogens carry with them their specific antigens, and it's the antigens we're going to develop an antibody to work against. So the first step is a dead or an active form of a pathogen is injected into the bloodstream. Once our bloodstream is flooded with these inactive or mild or weak or dead pathogens, our white blood cells start to kick into action and they start to develop the correct antibody that can lock on to this antigen. In other words, the antibody must have a complementary shape to the antigen. So white blood cells develop the correct antibody for the antigen on the pathogen. This can take a bit of time. So if you are infected again by the real pathogen, your white blood cells actually remember how to make the correct antibody. So the antibody gets rapidly reproduced, and then the disease is destroyed before you even have a chance to get ill. And that is how vaccinations work, and when you're in this state, you are said to be immune to a specific disease. So remember, a vaccination is a dead or inactive form of the disease, and that is aim 1. And now we can also explain how vaccinations work. So finally, let's evaluate the pros and the cons of any vaccination program. So there are many diseases for which if we hadn't developed a vaccine for, we'd have expected a far greater loss of human life. So basically, vaccines help control, and in some cases like smallpox, completely eradicate many infectious diseases. Also, if a vaccination program is successful in vaccinating the majority of a population, then it prevents epidemics from occurring. An epidemic is a mass outbreak of a specific disease. On the downside, vaccinations don't always work and developing them can be expensive. And in a few rare cases, some people can have a very bad reaction to specific vaccines. And that is how you evaluate the pros and cons of vaccination.